Hello everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be doing my reading wrap-up for October. So this month I feel like I didn't have as productive as a reading month as I would have ideally liked to have. I ended up just having a really busy month between personal stuff and then stuff going on with school. I had my honeymoon in the beginning of the month and I also had a lot of school projects that were coming up that I had to shift my attention to those instead of reading for pleasure. But I did kind of kick my ass into overdrive with the last week of the month and got a lot of the books that I had been starting at the beginning of the month done by that time, so that I would be able to include them in this reading wrap-up. Overall, I read 7 books this month. I read 4 on audio, 2 physical, and then 1 as an ebook. All the books I read were adult except for 1, which was young adult, and I'd say the majority of them, except for 1, had a very spooky fall-time vibe to them, and then 1 book that was the outlier was a historical romance. My average rating was a 3.64, which I think pretty well reflects my reading taste this month. I didn't have any 5 stars, although I did have some 4.5 stars. I think a lot of the books I read were just kind of mediocre to moderately enjoyable, which is another reason why I feel a little bit unsatisfied with this last month's reading. But at the same time, I did read some books I really enjoyed, and I'm very excited to tell you about them today. I think we're going to start by talking about all of the spooky books I read first, and then we'll move into the one outlier at the end. So with that intro out of the way, let's get into the video. The first book we are going to be talking about is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. This book is told through the interview as a framing device, with the main character Louis telling an unnamed reporter his life story, starting in the 1700s when he is transformed into a vampire by another vampire named Lestat. This book is quite famous. There's been a lot of adaptations over the years in varying mediums. I ended up giving this book a 4.5 stars. Obviously, this time of year is the perfect time to be reading a vampire story, but it also was the time that the AMC TV show adaptation was coming out, so I knew I wanted to read this book in anticipation for that, and I was very pleased that I did. Like a lot of people, I think my favorite section of this book is the part when Lestat baby traps Louis by making their immortal daughter Claudia. And I just really love their little fucked up family dynamic. I was also really fascinated with a section in the middle of the book where they go to Eastern Europe and meet these kind of more zombie living corpse type vampires. This section is not in the movie adaptation, so I'm very interested in if they're going to include it in the TV show adaptation for the next season. I also really love the section with the Théâtre de Vampire characters. I really loved Armand being so insanely old and very unhuman that it really throws Louis for a loop, especially since his other experience with vampires was with Lestat, who, even though he was a vampire, he still acted very human. I really enjoyed the relationship between Louis and Armand as well, and I can't wait to read Armand's book. I can see why he's such a fan favorite. I think a big theme of this book is kind of seeing who is deserving of life and who deserves to die. There's a lot of sections of Louis questioning religion and what is the nature of evil. And also Louis having a lot of internal strife, kind of always feeling an outsider and someone that often lets other people down. And I think that being Louis' whole journey, it kind of really makes a lot of sense why people kind of cling to this story as having a lot of queer allegory in it. I did want to also mention the TV show and the movie adaptations here, because I was really impressed with how many sections from the movie are directly replicated from the original text. So many really great scenes are replicated from the book into the movie and TV show adaptations that I was like, wow, Anne Rice really popped off here. This book did take me quite a long time to read. I think I started it in the middle of September and I didn't finish it until at least a month later. I think a big section of that is that this book is very dense. And there are a lot of sections where Louis is really deep in his head and it can get quite depressing. But I did really enjoy it and I'm very excited to continue on with the rest of the series. This version of Lestat is very jarring, just considering how aggressive and rude he is to Louis here, when in later books he's obviously the main character and he's much more of the fun one. So I'm interested in seeing just how his character progression changes throughout the different books. The next book we are going to be talking about is Slewfoot by Brom. This book is a horror historical fiction set during Puritan times. The main character Abatha has her husband die and then she's kind of shunned as an outcast by her whole village. And she meets a spirit of the forest named Samson who offers to help her out in taking care of her farm. This book I ended up giving a 3 stars, which is a little bit disappointing for me because I know it is very well loved by the horror book community. I do see why people like it, but I just think in the end it wasn't for me. I think one thing that I would have loved is if the structure was a little bit different, because I didn't really like waiting until the last 10% of the book to really see all of the revenge plot take hold. We get little sprinkles of kind of victories for Abatha earlier on, but it just kind of felt like for the majority of the book she was really hanging on by a thread, so it was hard to really feel happy for her or any sort of sense of relief. Even though the sections were also very hard to watch, I did really feel that the kind of portrayal of the witch trials was very accurate for the time, and also kind of seeing how quickly the paranoia and kind of turning against one person could set in, and kind of explaining the sort of witch trial mindset to a modern audience. One thing I also didn't really like is I just felt that the relationship of Abatha and Samson was really just not giving. It felt like Samson was really self-centered and didn't really care about Abatha beyond what she could give him until like the very end of the book. So I didn't really see their friendship being on very equal terms or really any sort of like viable romantic connection that I know a lot of people see in this book. One thing I do want to do is give a lot of praise to the audiobook because there's a section kind of like around the halfway mark where Abatha sings a song, and in the audiobook the narrator sings the song and it really slaps. It really heightens the experience and really like draws you into the story. So I definitely would recommend listening to the audiobook over reading it physically. The next book we are going to be talking about is In the House in the Dark of the Woods by Laird Hunt. This is also set during Puritan times and follows a unnamed narrator as she gets lost in the woods. And the novel basically follows her attempts to return home. And there's a lot of like fantastical and fucked up stuff in the woods that's trying to prevent her from going home. It has very, very strong like kind of dark fairy tale energy. And I ended up giving this book a 3.5 stars. At the beginning, I wasn't sure if I liked the writing style. I felt it was a little bit jarring and difficult to read, but I did get over it and ended up liking the rest of the story. There definitely are quite a few standout moments in here with a very strong, like, creepy atmosphere where I was like, I don't like this. The ending of this book is quite open-ended, and it's one of those ones where I feel like I need to do some, like, sleuthing online, looking at, like, Reddit posts to try and figure out what it all means. Although at the same time, I did think that there were quite a few kind of like hints of foreshadowing early on in the books that when I read the ending, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense now based on what we read earlier. So even though the ending is kind of open-ended, it does kind of have satisfying aspects because you can sort of see how the whole story progresses in that way. In that way, I think the book does have a lot of depth and would do well with having a reread in the future. Although at the same time, I do kind of wonder if this book is a little bit more like the artsy-fartsy sides of horror, where it's just kind of weird for weird's sake. I don't know, I just think there's a lot of like different interpretations you could go with for this book, and it's definitely one that I was glad that I read. And this is a book that I actually got for like $1 as like an impulse buy when I was at the thrift store. I hadn't seen anyone else talk about it on BookTube, and I'm glad I kind of like just like went with my instincts because of the cover being really cool. So yes, I'm very glad I picked this up. It's also quite short. I think it's just over like 200 pages. So yeah, if you're interested in looking for like a quicker, more like unsettling horror read, I would definitely check this out. The next book we are going to be talking about is The Grimrose Girls by Laura Pohl. This book is about 4 friends who go to a prestigious boarding school. At the start of their school year, one of their friends ends up committing suicide. The rest of the girls in the group are convinced that their friend did not end up killing herself and that there's something more sinister going on. At the same time, a new student joins their kind of friend group and decides to help them out in kind of doing their investigation. This book is also pitched as having a like Descendants energy, so each of the girls has kind of like a parallel to a traditional fairy tale. So the main girl is supposed to be Cinderella, there's another friend who is supposed to be Aurora from Sleeping Beauty, and so on and so forth. This book I ended up giving a 2.5 stars. I think the big thing was that I was just really bored for the majority of it. I think that this book really suffers from what I would consider like first in a series syndrome, where there's just a lot of things in here kind of setting up B plots for the characters that are not going to be paid off in this first book. And because there were just so many of those side B plots, I just kind of felt like it muddled the waters a little bit and didn't really like entice me to continue on with the main story. I think another thing is this book feels a lot longer than it is. It just felt like there were quite a few scenes that kind of went through the same circular logic over and over again. When, at least in my perspective, the reasoning behind why they were doing those things was very straightforward. I think for those reasons, I'm not going to be continuing with this series, and I'll probably unhaul this book in the near future. Hey, remember when I said I was going to read some of the other books in the Vampire Chronicles series now that I read Interview with a Vampire? Well, another one of those that I read was Prince Lestat by Anne Rice. This book, I want to say, is like the 11th in this series. It basically is the start of a new trilogy that Anne Rice wrote 10 years after she had originally finished the Vampire Chronicles. It basically follows the original Vampire Chronicles crew in what they've been doing in the modern era in 2013. There's apparently a lot of new characters in this, but despite only having read the first original 3 books, I did not feel like I needed a lot of background to know what was going on. If I met a character I wasn't familiar with, I would be like, okay, is this character new or they're just from a book I haven't read yet? I could just go on the Vampire Chronicles wiki and it would give me like a rough summary of them. This book also has like quite a few appendices in it, so there's a lot of like background information for you to go back and learn about the characters, as well as like different like terminology in the lore. I feel like despite this book being named after Lestat, there are quite a lot of sections that are third person, insert random other character here. Without those other sections, the book would have definitely been a lot shorter and maybe would have been better with a little bit more editing. But at the same time, I did really like it. I think it's a little bit of a case of having your cake and eating it too. Like, I do like seeing all the extended sections of the lore, but at the same time, I do want to see the original squad and see things from Lestat's perspective more. Without giving any spoilers, there was one section where Lestat meets a character who has some familial connection to him, and of course, knowing my tastes in tropes, I really enjoyed this. I also really liked that as the story progresses, the main antagonist kind of like unfolds very quietly in the background. And I really liked that we as a reader are able to kind of pick up and see what's going on, but it's the characters in the stories like being so disconnected that they're only getting very small fragments of it. And I just really enjoyed that method of telling the story. I ended up giving this 4 stars, and I definitely am excited to read more of the new trilogy of the books as well as going back and reading from the very beginning. Actually, can you summon this beast out of... Baby, I have to film. The next book we are going to be talking about is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfeld. This book is set during 2 timelines. One follows Leah, who is working on a submarine for this deep sea mission, and the other is from her wife Miri's perspective after Leah has returned from this mission, and something has changed Leah and their relationship is now very tense. This book was one of my most anticipated releases for this year, and it definitely didn't disappoint. I ended up giving this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. This book is horror mixed with literary fiction, so there's definitely some disturbing elements in it, but I think it's much more about using the horror elements more as an allegory for other things. I think a big theme of this book is about grief and letting go. Miri is mourning the end of her relationship, and that kind of mirrors the relationship that Miri had with her mother at the end of her mother's life. This book is quite slow, but it's building tension in what I would consider a very positive way. I like that you can really get into Miri's head and kind of like see how hopeless and helpless that she's feeling. I did like one half of the ending, but I felt like the reasoning behind like why it was happening was a little lacking, or maybe like just didn't make as much sense in my head as other things I had conceptualized. But like I said, at the same time, I did really enjoy it, and I thought the horror elements in it were definitely really well done. This book is also another like relatively short horror novel. I read this through an ebook and it was just over 200 pages. So if you're interested in a short horror novel through more of a literary fiction lens, I definitely would check this out. I honestly forgot about this book and I wasn't going to include it, but I guess I'll throw it in right here. I did have one DNF this month, and that was The Nature of Witches. I started this audiobook because I thought it would be interesting, but then I quickly realized that it was YA, and 2, that the main character was just incredibly insufferable. I really just liked her, and I just could see aspects of where the story was going that I wasn't going to enjoy. So I decided to cut it off pretty early. I think I probably only read like the first 10% of the audiobook. I know this book is quite well loved, and people say it has really good fall atmosphere in particular, but I don't think that the vibes alone are enough to keep me invested in this type of story. Okay, with all of my spooky fall time books out of the way, we can talk about the last book I read in October, which was The Queer Principles of Kitt Webb by Cat Sebastian. This book is a MLM historical romance set during the 1750s. The main character Kitt used to be a highwayman until he got injured on the job and had to retire. But he gets an offer from the other main character, Percy, to help him rob his father, who is this duke that Kitt has previous tragic backstory with. So I found this book because I saw a post on Twitter basically saying that this was kind of more of a grown-up gentleman's guide, which really is to say that it's a gay adventure romance that's set during the 1700s in England. The easiest way to get me to read a book is describe something as being similar to Gentleman's Guide, because I'm constantly chasing that feeling that I got from that book. And then when I found the audiobook on Libby that was easily available, I said, okay, yeah, let's go for it now. This book is a slow burn, ? I would say it's around 60% in and anything really happens. But there's plenty of pining and kind of compromising situations for them to be pining in. I ended up giving this book a 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I really loved the main characters' banter. I thought they were really cute, and I was just smiling so much of the time I was reading it. I also felt like the backstories made sense for why they would have miscommunication. Miscommunication is obviously a huge staple trope in the romance genre, but I absolutely hate it. But with this one, I was like, okay, it makes sense why they would be withholding information from each other. And it's not really miscommunication as the source of strife, between the two. It's more internal stuff. With both of the characters being I can't tell him all of my secrets because I've been brought up in a way to never really show my full hand. And actually, when they do have a fight, it's quickly resolved with real ass communication, and it's great. There's also a twist in this book, and I felt like a genius when I figured out what the twist is going to be. Even if it is somewhat of an obvious twist, I always feel like fucking Sherlock when I'm able to call out a twist before it happened. Talking in terms of Gentleman's Guide vibes, I do think it was similar to it. It definitely was less adventure-y, but it was really fun, and I could see myself reading more from the series in the future. I believe the sequel to this is a het romance between two bisexual main characters, and this author also has quite a large backlist of both MLM and also sapphic historical romances, which I'm always happy to find an author that can do it all, so I definitely will check out more of her work in the future. So that is all of the books that I ended up reading this last month in October. I'd love to hear in the comments down below what was your favorite book you read this last month, what was your least favorite book that you read this last month. As always, please consider liking this video or subscribing if you aren't already. Also consider following me on the Storygraph. I have it linked down below, but I never remember to promo it in my videos. I'm pretty active down there, like constantly updating my books as I read them, so if you're interested in figuring out what I'm reading before I do one of these like monthly wrap-ups, I would definitely check that out. And I also would love to follow more people on there as well to see what other people are reading in real time. But anyway, that is it from me today. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!